It is the autumn of 1942. Somewhere in the English countryside, a man is running through the dark. The night is moonless, chosen deliberately, and the only sound is the soft percussion of boots on wet grass and the ragged breath of exertion. He is not fleeing, he is training in his right hand, gripped with a familiarity that speaks of weeks of repetition, is a weapon unlike anything the British Armed Forces have, issued in modern memory. It is not a bayonet, it is not quite a knife. It sits somewhere between a cleaver and a short sword with a blade, nearly as wide as a man's palm and a heft that communicates, even in the dark, an unmistakable sense of purpose. He pulls up short, pivots on his back foot, and drives the weapon forward in a single controlled motion. The target, a sacking dummy stuffed with straw, offers no resistance. It rarely does. The man with the blade is one of hundreds scattered across remote estates, commando training schools, and clandestine facilities. Throughout Britain in those desperate middle years of the Second World War, he may be a commando destined for a raid on the Norwegian coast. He may be an agent of the Special Operations Executive, soon to be dropped by parachute into occupied France. He may be an American Office of Strategic Services recruit, sent to Britain to learn the dark arts of irregular warfare from men who had elevated violence to a science. Whatever his destination, he has been handed the same weapon, taught by the same philosophy, and sent into the same unforgiving darkness to master something the military establishment had resisted for decades, the brutal, unglamorous, and entirely necessary craft of killing at close quarters. The weapon in his hand is the Smatchet, and the man who designed it, a lean, quietly ferocious Scot named William Fairbairn, believed it might be one of the most important pieces of equipment the Allies would produce in the entire war. He was not wrong. Understanding why Britain needed the Smatchet requires understanding the world from which it emerged, not the world of battlefields and artillery barrages, but the shadow world of resistance fighters, partisan cells, saboteurs, and agents working behind enemy lines, where the ordinary tools of soldiering were either unavailable or a liability. By 1940, Nazi Germany had occupied an arc of Europe stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border. Millions of people lived under occupation, and from the very first days of that occupation, small pockets of resistance had begun to organize. Churchill's response was to create the Special Operations Executive in July 1940, tasked with, in his memorable instruction, setting Europe ablaze. The agents the SOE would send into the field faced a problem that no quantity of conventional military training could solve. They would operate in cities and farmhouses and forests where a firearms report could bring German soldiers within minutes. They would work at night in cramped spaces in conditions where the margin between success and capture was measured in seconds and inches. They needed weapons that could kill silently, reliably, and in the hands of people who were not professional soldiers, men and women who might be teachers, clerks, or farmers by trade, trained in a matter of weeks to perform acts of terrible violence with the minimum of fuss and the maximum of certainty. The tools available at the outbreak of war were, to put it plainly, inadequate. Standard-issue bayonets were designed for use on the end of a rifle, not as standalone weapons. Commando knives of the period, including the early versions of the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, which Fairbairn himself had co-designed, were superb instruments in the hands of an expert, but demanded a level of precise anatomical knowledge and trained hand-to-hand skill that could not be instilled in a few weeks of training. A thrust to the jugular with a slender blade is devastatingly effective. If you are calm, accurate, and confident, if you are terrified, operating in complete darkness and struggling with a German sentry twice your size, precision becomes a luxury you may not possess. Something else was needed. Something that was forgiving of imprecision. Something that could wound severely and incapacitate quickly even when deployed by someone whose hands were shaking. William Fairbairn had spent his professional life in exactly the environment where these questions mattered most. Born in 1885, he had joined the Shanghai Municipal Police in 1907 and spent the following 3 decades in one of the most violent cities on earth. Shanghai in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s was a labyrinth of criminal gangs, opium, dens, and jurisdictional chaos, a place where a police officer might face an armed Tong warrior, a drunken sailor, and a knife-wielding addict in the same evening shift. Fairbairn had been stabbed, shot at, and beaten on multiple occasions. He had studied judo, jiu-jitsu, and Chinese boxing, not as recreation, but as professional necessity. By the time he left Shanghai in 1940 to join the war effort, he had been involved in, by his own estimate, well over 600 documented violent encounters. He was 55 years old and he understood violence with the empirical clarity of a man who had survived it repeatedly. The Smatchet emerged from that experience. Fairbairn had long believed that the theoretical precision demanded by conventional close combat doctrine was a fantasy when tested against the reality of adrenaline, darkness, and physical struggle. He wanted a weapon that operated on a different principle entirely, not precision, but mass effect, not the surgical thrust, but the broad, devastating strike that did not require the user to find a precise anatomical target in the dark. He took his inspiration from several directions. The machete, long used in agricultural and jungle contexts, offered a wide blade capable of devastating chopping wounds. The short swords and falchions of medieval Europe suggested that a heavy, wide blade with a pronounced point of balance towards the tip created a weapon with tremendous striking momentum. Fairbairn synthesized these influences into something new. The Smatchet, in its final production form, was a remarkable piece of engineering reduced to deliberate simplicity. The overall length ran to approximately 44 centimeters, 17.5 inches, of which roughly 29 centimeters, 11.5 inches, comprised the blade. That blade was the key to everything. Where a conventional fighting knife tapers to a slim thrusting point, the Smatchet's blade is leaf-shaped, widening from the handle before tapering back towards a substantial point, reaching a maximum width of approximately 7 centimeters, 2.75 inches at its broadest. The cross-section of the blade was a double-edged configuration with a pronounced central ridge giving the weapon rigidity without excessive weight. The whole piece weighed roughly 680 grams, about 24 ounces, less than a standard bag of flour, but substantially heavier than a conventional fighting knife. That weight was not accidental. The physics of the Smatchet were deliberately calculated, with the weight distributed towards the forward portion of the blade. A swing carried momentum in the manner of a small axe rather than a knife. A downward stroke from a man of average strength, delivered to an opponent's forearm, collarbone, or skull, generated force comparable to a sharp blow from a small hammer. More critically, the wide blade meant that even a glancing strike, the kind of imprecise blow a terrified agent might deliver in a dark corridor, created a wound of sufficient severity to incapacitate. A narrow blade that strikes at an angle may slip or skate across bone. A blade 7 centimeters wide has nowhere to go but into tissue. This was the Smatchet's core innovation. It democratized serious violence, making it accessible to the partially trained rather than reserving it for the expert. The handle was equally considered, a robust, oval-sectioned grip of compressed leather washers, the same construction method used on the Fairbairn Sykes knife, sat in the hand with sufficient bulk to prevent the weapon rotating on impact. A heavy steel pommel, almost disc-like in profile, provided a secondary striking surface and served as a counterbalance. Between blade and handle, a substantial double-edged crossguard protected the hand during close struggle. The whole assembly had a purposeful, no-nonsense aesthetic. There is nothing decorative about the Smatchet. It does not look like something hung on a wall. It looks like something built to work. Production of the Smatchet was carried out by several British manufacturers during the war, with Wilkinson's sword already deeply involved in producing the Fairbairn Sykes knife. Among those contracted, to supply examples, precise production numbers remain elusive. Wartime manufacturing records were imperfectly kept. Classification remained in place for years after the conflict, and the clandestine nature of the weapon's primary users meant that comprehensive tallies were never a priority. Estimates suggest that several thousand examples were produced across the war years, though some researchers place the figure higher. What is certain is that the weapon was manufactured in sufficient quantity to equip SOE agents, OSS personnel, and elements of the Commandos and airborne forces, and that examples reached theaters of operation as varied as Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and Southeast Asia. Training with the Smatchet was inseparable from Fairbairn's broader philosophy of close combat instruction. He taught the weapon at the SOE's training schools, most notably at Arisaig House in the remote Scottish Highlands, where agents bound for occupied Europe underwent their paramilitary preparation. He also carried his methods to North America, training OSS personnel at Camp X in Ontario, Canada, a facility jointly operated by British intelligence and the nascent American Secret Service, and at various American installations. His co-instructor and fellow Shanghai veteran Eric Sykes shared the teaching duties. Fairbairn's training program for the Smatchet was, by design, abbreviated. Unlike the years of practice required to develop genuine proficiency with a conventional fighting blade, he maintained that the Smatchet's basic offensive capability could be instilled in a matter of days. The core technique was a figure-of-8 swinging motion that allowed the broad blade to generate repeated strikes with the momentum already described, combined with a straight thrusting motion exploiting the weapon's point. Students practiced on dummy targets, on one another, with rubber training versions, and in simulated night scenarios designed to replicate the conditions under which they would actually employ the weapon. Fairbairn was not interested in creating swordsmen. He was interested in creating people capable of surviving and prevailing in a few seconds of savage, unlit chaos. Documented operational use of the Smatchet is, by the nature of clandestine warfare, fragmentary. SOE agents operated under strict secrecy, their after-action reports classified for decades and, in many cases, never fully declassified or simply lost. What the historical record does preserve is a series of accounts, some first-hand, some reported through handlers, that speak to the weapon being carried and employed across multiple theaters. In France, agents of the SOE's F section, those working in the direct action networks rather than the intelligence circuits, were equipped with Smatchets as a matter of routine alongside their suppressed pistols and explosive materials. There are accounts from the Italian partisan networks, supplied and advised by SOE's Italian operations, of the Smatchet being valued, precisely because it required no ammunition and produced no sound. In the jungles of Burma and Malaya, where Force 136, SOE's Far Eastern arm, worked alongside indigenous resistance fighters, the weapon's broad blade found an additional utility. It was a functional jungle tool as well as a weapon capable of clearing light vegetation and performing the rough cutting tasks that a survival situation demands. This dual functionality was not lost on those who issued and carried it. The psychological dimension of the Smatchet is worth considering, separately from its physical capabilities. Fairbairn was explicit in his published writings and his training lectures that the purpose of the weapon was not merely physical but psychological, that an agent who carried a weapon they genuinely believed could protect them would act with a confidence and decisiveness that unarmed or inadequately armed agents could not summon. This was not empty theory. Combat psychology, even in its relatively primitive wartime understanding, had long recognized that confidence in one's equipment translated directly into performance under stress. An agent who believed their Smatchet would stop a German sentry, and Fairbairn's training was carefully designed to install that belief, was an agent who would press forward rather than freeze. Germany's approach to close combat weaponry during the same period provides an instructive contrast. The Wehrmacht and SS produced a considerable variety of fighting knives, gravity knives, and paratrooper blades throughout the war, most notably the range of Kampfmesser, literally fighting knives, issued to various specialist units. These tended towards the conventional in their design, single or double-edged, blades of 15 to 20 centimeters, conventional crossguards and designs that emphasized thrusting capability over the wide blade slashing approach embodied in the Smatchet. The Luftwaffe's gravity knife, the Fallschirmjäger Messer, was a notably practical piece of engineering designed primarily as a survival tool for parachutists who might need to cut themselves free of entangled rigging, with its blade deploying through a gravity and button mechanism. It was not primarily a fighting weapon, and its blade geometry reflected that. German Commando-style units occasionally carried captured Allied weapons or private purchase blades, but no German equivalent of the Smatchet, no weapon specifically designed on. The Mass Effect wide blade principle appears in the German procurement record. American efforts in the close combat blade category are more varied and arguably more sophisticated in some respects, though not in the direction of the Smatchet. The United States Marine Corps Raider Stiletto, introduced in 1942, was a slender, double-edged thrusting weapon of considerable elegance, highly effective in trained hands, but embodying precisely the precision-dependent philosophy that Fairbairn had rejected. The M3 trench knife, the most widely issued American fighting knife of the war, was a more conventional single-edged design, of roughly 17 centimeters blade length, functional and well-made, but, again, operating on different principles than the British weapon. Neither the American nor the German approach replicated Fairbairn's wide blade, mass effect concept. In this respect, the Smatchet was genuinely novel. The Smatchet's influence did not end with the war. Fairbairn's methods, including his Smatchet doctrine, were absorbed into the curricula of post-war intelligence and special forces training programs on both sides of the Atlantic. The OSS's successor organization, the Central Intelligence Agency, maintained close combat training programs in the post-war years that drew heavily on Fairbairn's wartime teaching. British special forces, reorganized and rationalized in the post-war period, retained elements of the Fairbairn-Sykes tradition in their close combat instruction. In the commercial and collector world, the Smatchet has achieved a particular status. Surviving original examples command significant prices at specialist arms auctions, reflecting both their relative scarcity and their association with the romantic, if deadly, world of SOE operations. Several British and American manufacturers have produced reproduction Smatchets over the decades, serving the collector market, and, in some cases, the living history and martial arts communities that study Second World War combatives. Fairbairn's own writings, particularly his 1942 manual All in Fighting, republished in various forms under different titles, remain in print and are studied by military historians, combatives, instructors, and students of irregular warfare. Original Smatchets can be examined in several British collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples, and the collection at the Royal Armouries in Leeds includes specimens that allow the weapon's construction and balance to be appreciated in something approaching their physical reality. Regional museums with strong regimental or intelligence history collections occasionally surface examples as well, though the provenance of individual pieces is often difficult too. Established definitively given the clandestine circumstances of their original issue. Return, for a moment, to that darkened field in the English countryside. Autumn 1942. A man with a leaf-shaped blade and a handful of weeks. Training, preparing himself for something the normal world would never know he had done. He does not know, in that moment of training, whether he will use the weapon he carries. He hopes he will not need to. But Fairbairn has given him something more valuable than a blade. He has given him a philosophy that violence, when it becomes necessary, should be overwhelming rather than elegant, decisive rather than precise, effective rather than heroic. The Smatchet was the physical expression of that philosophy. It was wide, where conventional wisdom suggested narrow. It was heavy, where tradition demanded lightness. It was designed for the partially trained where most weapons required the expert, and in that deliberate inversion of received doctrine lay its entire contribution. The recognition that the people who would most need a close combat weapon in the coming years were not professional soldiers schooled in the art of the blade, but terrified civilians turned reluctant warriors who needed something that worked even when everything else, their training, their composure, their planning, had fallen apart. Across occupied Europe, in the jungles of Burma, in the farmhouses and back streets and freezing forests where the shadow war was fought, men and women carried the Smatchet through some of the most dangerous operations of the Second World War. Most of them came back. The records do not always tell us why, but somewhere in those survival stories, in the fragmented and classification-shrouded accounts of clandestine operations, the Smatchet played its part, quietly, brutally, and with a devastating efficiency that its creator would have recognized as exactly the point William Fairbairn understood. better than almost any one of his. Generation, that war, at its most intimate, is not about courage or strategy or the grand sweep of armies. It is about who is still standing when the noise stops. The Smatchet was his answer to that question, forged in the darkness of a Shanghai alley and refined in the desperate urgency of a world at war. It is a brutal piece of work. It was designed to be